Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into the Black Death, a period of history so transformative, so terrifying, it's kind of hard to fully grasp.
It really is.
We've got a wealth of information here, mainly drawing from, the extensive details compiled on Wikipedia. It gives us the historical backdrop, our current scientific understanding, and a look at the truly mind-boggling impact.
Yeah, the scale is just staggering.
Our mission today is to try and cut through that complexity, pull out the crucial insights,
Yeah.
and really understand how this catastrophe unfolded and how it continues to resonate.
Absolutely. We're talking about an estimated 25 to 50 million deaths. That's just in mid-14th century Europe.
50 million.
Potentially. Could be up to half the population at the time. It's a scale of loss almost unimaginable today.
And this wasn't just a one-off tragedy, was it?
No, not at all. It actually marked the start of the Second Plague pandemic, a series of recurring outbreaks that went on for centuries.
Wow. And at the heart of it all, we now know, was the bacterium Yersinia pestis.
That's the culprit.
A tiny organism, but wielding such devastating power, spread mainly through infected fleas, often on rats, and, alarmingly, through the air, too.
Right, the pneumonic plague form. Extremely dangerous.
It's almost impossible to overstate the significance, isn't it? The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis.
Not even close. It was a massive turning point. It triggered these profound shifts in population, economy, religion, society, culture, everything, really.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe start with the name itself. Black Death sounds pretty dramatic. Do they actually call it that at the time?
That's a great question. And interestingly, no. The term Black Death wasn't used by people living through it in the 14th century. Not in any European language, anyway.
So what does they call that?
They tended to focus on the sheer scale of death. They used terms like pestis, pestilentia, epidemia, mortalitas in Latin.
Right, it's basically...
Pestilence, epidemic, mortality, pretty direct. In English, before the 18th century, it was just the pestilence, the great pestilence, the plague, or sometimes the great death.
The Great Death. That tells you something right there.
It certainly does. It reflects that immediate terror and the widespread nature of the dying.
So where did Black Death come from then? It's such a common name now.
It seems it caught on much, much later, probably in the 15th and 16th centuries, largely thanks to Swedish and Danish chroniclers, actually.
Scandinavia.
Yeah. The Danish phrase den sorte dead literally means the Black Death. And this term was then borrowed or calqued into other languages.
So it was translated directly.
Pretty much. The first time we see it used in English for this specific pandemic isn't until 1755. And it was a translation of that Danish term.
Huh. So before that specific term took hold, was there a more common description?
Well, as I said, variations of Great Death were common, like the Latin Magna Mortalitas. But the idea of associating black with death isn't new, of course. It goes way back. Yeah, even Homer, in the Odyssey talks about Scylla having mouths full of black death. And Seneca the Younger used the Latin more as a batra, black death. Possibly the first time an epidemic got that kind of description, emphasizing how deadly and dark it was.
So the phrase existed, just not for this particular plague initially.
Exactly. It wasn't a brand new phrase, just applied to this specific catastrophe much later. Even in the 12th and 13th centuries, a French physician used atra mors for a pestilential fever.
Okay.
And in 1350, an astronomer used Mors Nigra again, Black Death, in a poem. But it's not clear if he meant this pandemic specifically or just, death from disease generally.
So it took a long time to stick.
It really did. It wasn't until 1823 that the historian Elizabeth Penrose explicitly called the 14th century outbreak the Black Death. And then Cardinal Gasquet later on really linked it to bubonic plague and pointed out that atra mors appeared in a Danish history book in 1631 for this epidemic. He said they called it that because of its effects.
It's amazing how a name, applied centuries later, can so powerfully shape how we think about an event.
Absolutely. It frames it in a very specific, evocative way.
Now, you mentioned this wasn't the first time Yersinia pestis had caused major problems.
No, not by a long shot. Research suggests Yersinia pestis actually first started infecting humans way back. We're talking late Neolithic, early Bronze Age in Europe and Asia.
Neolithic, wow.
Yeah, there's even evidence from an ancient tomb in Sweden linked to what they call the Neolithic decline around 3000 BCE.
So this bacterium has been with us, causing trouble for millennia.
It seems so, and the specific form that fleas can transmit, we have evidence of that from Bronze Age remains near Samara, Russia.
Incredible. And were there major outbreaks before the Black Death?
Definitely. Symptoms that sound a lot like bubonic plague were described in the Roman Empire, centuries before the 14th century. Rufus of Ephesus wrote about them, suggesting it was around even before Emperor Trajan.
And then there was the big one, the plague of Justinian. That was Y. pestis too, right?
Yes, confirmed. The plague of Justinian, starting around 541 CE, with outbreaks continuing until about 750, that's considered the first plague pandemic.
The first pandemic.
And there are even hints it spread eastward. Chinese medical texts from the 7th century describe something called a malignant bubo, possibly linked to that first wave.
So, a long and deadly history puts the 14th century into a bit more context, doesn't it?
It really does. It wasn't something entirely new, even if the scale in the 14th century was unprecedented in Europe.
Okay, let's focus back on the 14th century then. Without germ theory, what did people think was causing the Black Death?
Well, explanations were all over the place, as you can imagine. One early idea, actually from the very prestigious medical faculty of Paris,
Right.
was that it was caused by a specific conjunction of planets, basically blaming the stars for creating a great pestilence in the air.
The miasma theory, right? Bad air.
Exactly. The belief that diseases came from foul or poisonous vapors, a very common idea for centuries.
Imagine the terror. Looking up at the sky for answers while people are dying all around you.
Must have been terrifying, and of course religious interpretations were also really widespread. In the Islamic world, for instance, many scholars saw it as a form of martyrdom and mercy from God, for believers promising paradise if they died from it.
Martyrdom.
Yes. But for non-believers, it was often seen as divine punishment. Interestingly, there wasn't total agreement on how to react. Some felt you shouldn't interfere with God's will.
Just accept it.
Kind of. While others drew on older medical traditions, like from the Greeks, and did try preventative measures.
A mix of fatalism and practical attempts. So what's our modern understanding?
Well, the predominant theory now, backed by a lot of evidence, centers on the Yersinia pestis bacterium. It's what we call enzootic, meaning it naturally lives in certain animal populations, specifically in fleas carried by ground rodents, things like marmots in places like Central Asia.
And the discovery of the bacterium itself, that was much later.
Oh yes, relatively recent. Alexander Yersin identified Y. pestis in 1894.
1894, so like 500 years later.
Exactly. During a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, he also found it in rodents, correctly identifying rats as the main carriers, or vectors.
And how it spreads via fleas.
That was figured out then, too.
Shortly after, yeah, Paul Louis Simon figured out the mechanism in 1898. It's actually quite grimly clever. The bacteria block the flea's digestive tract.
So the flea starves.
Effectively, yes. And it makes the flea desperate to feed, but when it bites, instead of sucking blood in, it essentially regurgitates the bacteria into the bite wound.
Ugh. Horrible. Okay, so DNA evidence has been key in confirming this for the Black Death.
Absolutely pivotal. In 2010, a major breakthrough. Researchers definitively found Yersinia pestis DNA in skeletons from Black Death mass graves across Europe.
So that settled the debate. It was Y. pestis.
Pretty much, yeah. That specific finding really ended the major arguments about what pathogen caused it.
And has DNA helped trace its history further back?
It has. We now know the Black Death was caused by a specific variant of Y. pestis. And when they sequenced its genome, they found it was ancestral to most modern plague strains.
So it's like the grandparent strain. Kind of, yeah. It connects the dots between the earlier plague of Justinian and the later epidemics, like the third pandemic in the 19th century. We've even found prehistoric plague genomes now. It's incredible.
And we even know where the Black Death strain likely originated.
The evidence points strongly towards the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan. DNA found in burial sites there from the late 1330s, with inscriptions mentioning plague, seems to provide that crucial link.
Central Asia. So that's the likely starting point for this wave. But the Wikipedia entry mentioned some alternative theories or ongoing debates.
You're right. It's not completely cut and dried, especially regarding how it spread so effectively. While Y. pestis is confirmed, the exact transmission dynamics are still discussed.
Like what?
Well, some mathematical models suggest that human fleas and body lice might have played a bigger role than rats and their fleas, especially in explaining the sheer speed and death toll in Europe.
Human fleas and lice,
Yeah.
not just rats.
That's the argument. Some researchers feel the classic rat flea model, which is based a lot on studies of plague in India much later, might not perfectly fit the European 14th century situation.
What are the main points against the rat flea model being the only way it spread?
Several things. The potential involvement of other animals, maybe? Also, a lack of widespread archaeological evidence for huge rat die-offs in some key places like London.
You'd expect to find loads of rat bones if they were dying off first.
You might think so, yeah. And the speed it moved through some areas, it just seems really fast if it relied only on rats and their fleas moving it along.
Yeah.
This makes some researchers think person-to-person transmission was maybe more significant than we used to believe.
So the picture's still evolving a bit, even with the DNA confirmation.
The presence of Y. pestis is solid, but the relative importance of the different ways it spread bubonic via fleas, pneumonic person-to-person, even the septicemic form, that's still an active area of research.
So maybe a combination of factors.
Many experts think so. A mix of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague, possibly even interacting with other diseases around at the time, like typhus or smallpox. But importantly, no other single epidemic pathogen has been found in the Black Death burial sites to support a completely different cause. Y. pestis is definitely there.
Okay, let's shift to how this thing actually moved across continents. We know the
Yeah.
biological factors, but what about the conditions on the ground?
Yeah. A huge factor was the generally poor sanitation and lack of hygiene in the 14th century.
Right, no germ theory.
Exactly. Centuries away from that understanding. European cities were often incredibly dirty. Think open sewers, animals just roaming the streets. Human parasites like lice and fleas were common. It was an ideal breeding ground for disease.
The descriptions are pretty grim. Street names in Paris literally referring to waste.
It paints a picture, doesn't it? Waste disposal was haphazard. Constant complaints about smells and filth. Even basic sanitation rules were rudimentary, like having to shout before you dumped your chamber pot out the window.
Nice. And personal hygiene.
Not great by our standards. And some early Christian views even saw bathing as potentially sinful, a temptation. So, yeah, not ideal conditions.
Definitely sounds like it would help something like plague spread. So against that backdrop, how did it actually get into Europe?
The most widely accepted story involves Genoese trading ships. They arrived from Kaffa, a port in the Crimea, back in 1347.
Kaffa, what was happening there?
Kaffa was a Genoese trading post, and it was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde at the time.
Oh.
During the siege, the Mongol army, who were apparently already suffering from the plague themselves, reportedly started, catapulting infected corpses over the city wall.
Oh, seriously? Biological warfare in the 14th century.
It's a horrifying account attributed to Gabriele de Mussi. Even if that specific story is debated, it's highly likely that infected rats also crossed the siege lines. Disease was definitely rampant in the Mongol camp.
Just a truly awful image. So the Genoese traders fled Kaffa.
Yes. As the disease took hold inside the city, they fled by sea, carrying the plague with them across the Black Sea. They reached Constantinople in the summer of 1347.
From Constantinople, it spread.
Like wildfire. It hit Constantinople hard, caused repeated outbreaks there, and from that major hub, ships carried it to other Mediterranean ports very quickly.
So the trade route basically became disease vectors.
Absolutely. By October 1347, it hit Sicily, arriving via Genoese galleys, spread rapidly there. Those same ships reached Genoa and Venice by January 1348. But the outbreak in Pisa seems to have been the main gateway into northern Italy.
And then into France.
Soon after. A ship, apparently expelled from Italy, arrived in Marseille late January 1348. That introduced it to France. It just followed the trade routes relentlessly.
A terrifying domino effect.
Precisely. From Italy and France, it moved northwest Spain, Portugal, England by June 1348. Then it swept east and north, Germany, Scotland, Scandinavia between 1348 and 1350.
How did it get to places like Norway?
Again, ships. It arrived in Norway in 1349 on a ship that landed near Bergen. And by 1352, it had reached northern Russia, hitting Moscow in 1353.
Were any areas spared?
Some were less affected. Places with fewer trade links, maybe more isolated areas like the Basque Country, parts of modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. Some remote alpine villages seemed to fare a bit better.
What about West Asia and North Africa? Was it just as bad there?
Oh, absolutely. The impact was catastrophic. Massive depopulation, huge economic and social changes that lasted.
How did it get there?
It reached Alexandria in Egypt by autumn 1347, likely from Constantinople on a ship, maybe a slave ship. Then it spread up the Nile.
To Cairo.
Reached Cairo by late summer 1348. It was a huge city, a center of the Islamic world. Mortality was immense. The Sultan even fled the city. Apparently, the Nile was choked with bodies at one point.
Unbelievable.
And plague kept coming back to Cairo for centuries. From Egypt, it spread eastward, Gaza, Damascus, Aleppo by late 1347, hit Jerusalem, Antioch, basically swept through the region.
So the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East.
Within about 2 years, yeah. It spread throughout the Islamic world, down into Arabia, across North Africa. Mecca got infected in 1348, probably via pilgrims. It even reached Yemen by 1351.
The geographical scope is just immense. Let's talk about the human experience. The symptoms. What was it actually like?
Contemporary accounts, though sometimes imprecise, paint a picture of absolute agony. The classic symptom of bubonic plague was the bubo.
The swellings, right?
Yes, gavociolos, as Boccaccio called them. Severely swollen, incredibly painful lymph nodes, usually in the groin, neck, or armpits, like huge boils that would ooze pus and blood if opened.
Boccaccio's description is so vivid. He mentioned dark spots, too.
He did, often followed by dark, freckle-like spots or rashes on the skin, which might have actually been flea bites in some cases.
Yeah.
He called the bubo an infallible token of approaching death, although we know now that if a bubo burst and drained, people could sometimes recover.
What else besides the buboes?
Acute high fever, like 38 to 41 Celsius. Headaches, aching joints, terrible nausea and vomiting, just overwhelming malaise, and often vomiting blood. Death usually followed within 2 to 7 days for the bubonic form, if untreated. Mortality was maybe around 80%.
And the other forms, pneumonic and septicemic.
Even worse, if that's possible. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. People had fever, a terrible cough, and started spitting up blood-tinged sputum that quickly became thin, bright red, and free-flowing.
And that spread person to person easily.
Yes, through respiratory droplets. And the mortality rate was incredibly high, maybe 90–95%.
And septicemic.
That was the rarest, but almost universally fatal if untreated. Basically, the bacteria overwhelmed the bloodstream directly. People had raging fevers and developed these distinctive purple skin patches, purpura, from bleeding under the skin. It often killed so fast, buboes didn't even have time to form. Just a truly horrifying spectrum of ways to die.
Utterly gruesome.
Yeah.
The consequences. The death toll alone is staggering.
It really is. Exact figures are impossible, of course, but estimates for Eurasia range anywhere from 75 million up to 200 million deaths.
200 million.
That's a high-end estimate, but it gives you a sense of the potential scale. For Europe specifically, estimates usually fall between 25% and 60% of the entire population dying in just a few years.
60%. A majority.
Some respected scholars, like Benedicto, argue for around 60% mortality across Europe, maybe even higher, up to 80% in areas already suffering from malnutrition. Others, like Day Leader, suggest maybe 45–50% over 4 years, with higher rates in the Mediterranean and slightly lower in places like Germany and England, but still massive number.
We hear about mass graves.
Yes, archaeological evidence shows huge burial pits in many areas containing hundreds, sometimes thousands of bodies. They just couldn't keep up with individual burials.
That recent pollen study you mentioned earlier adds some nuance, though, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't uniformly devastating everywhere.
Exactly. That 2022 study looked at pollen data, which reflects agricultural activity. It suggested that while places like Scandinavia, France, Western Germany, Greece, Central Italy saw really significant drops in agriculture, indicating very high mortality, other regions like Central and Eastern Europe, Iberia, Ireland seem to have more continuity.
So it challenges the idea of a single, uniform wave of death wiping out the same percentage everywhere.
It does. It suggests a more complex, variable impact. Still devastating in many places, but perhaps not quite the universal, near-total collapse across every single region that is sometimes portrayed.
But still, cities were hit incredibly hard.
Oh, definitely. Crowded cities were death traps. Paris might have lost half its population of 100,000. Florence maybe have 2 tax records there, suggest 80% died in just 4 months in 1348. Hamburg, Bremen, maybe 60% or more. London, a similar percentage, perhaps 62,000 people.
And the clergy. Were they affected differently?
They suffered incredibly high mortality. Priests, monks, nuns tending to the sick and dying. They were right on the front lines. Many monasteries and parishes lost huge numbers.
Did mortality lessen in later outbreaks?
There's some evidence for that. A physician in Avignon observed that later outbreaks in the 1360s, 70s, 80s seemed less deadly overall and tended to affect children more. But the initial wave was catastrophic.
The personal accounts are just chilling. That chronicler from Siena, Agnello di Tura.
His account is devastating, describing how people abandoned the sick, how they couldn't find enough people to bury the dead, digging mass pits, dogs eating corpses in the streets. Just utter despair and the feeling that the world was ending.
And the impact wasn't limited to Europe. The Middle East suffered terribly, too.
Yes, estimates suggest around a third of the population died across the Middle East. Egypt might have lost 40% or more. Cairo, as we mentioned, was hit incredibly hard, losing maybe a third to 40% in just 8 months. Its population didn't fully recover for centuries.
Beyond the sheer death toll, the economic impact must have been immense.
Transformative, absolutely. The plague hit the poorest hardest, but it also created a sudden, massive labor shortage.
Because so many workers died.
Exactly. So survivors found their labor was suddenly in high demand. Wages soared.
Good for the workers, then.
In some ways, yes, but it also led to massive inflation, which ate away at those gains for many artisans and laborers. Landowners also had to adapt. With fewer tenants, rents collapsed in some areas. Many shifted from demanding labor service to asking for cash rent instead. Collecting taxes became incredibly difficult.
And trade.
Severely disrupted, especially across the Mongol Empire, which relied heavily on those trade routes. The plague is seen as a major factor in the eventual collapse of Mongol rule in places like China and Persia.
There was even that surprising theory about climate change.
Yeah, that study from Utrecht University, it's an interesting idea. They proposed that the sheer number of deaths, millions upon millions of people, led to vast areas of farmland being abandoned.
So trees grew back.
Exactly. Reforestation on a massive scale. Trees absorb carbon dioxide, so the theory is this might have actually cooled the atmosphere slightly, potentially contributing to the onset of the Little Ice Age.
Wow, an unintended environmental consequence. And sadly, like in many crises, did it lead to scapegoating?
Tragically, yes. Fear and panic fueled religious fanaticism and led to horrific persecutions. Minority groups were blamed.
Jews especially.
Jewish communities were primary targets. Wild accusations spread that they were poisoning wells, deliberately causing the plague. This led to terrible massacres across Europe, Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne. Entire communities were wiped out.
Just horrific.
Many survivors fled eastward, particularly to Poland, where King Casimir the Great offered them protection. But it wasn't just Jews. Friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, people with leprosy or other skin diseases, Romani people, anyone perceived as other or somehow responsible could become a target.
A very dark side to the human response. What about broader social and cultural shifts? Did the plague change how people viewed the world?
Profoundly. You see the dance of death or dance macabre motif becoming really popular in art around this time.
Showing death coming for everyone, rich and poor.
Exactly. The great equalizer. Some historians argue the sheer devastation, particularly in places like Florence, led to a shift in worldview. Less focus on the afterlife, more on earthly life, human potential, potentially contributing to the spirit of the Renaissance.
Is that widely accepted?
It's debated. The Renaissance was complex, obviously, but the plague certainly shook existing structures to their core. It definitely didn't cause the Renaissance on its own, but it created a context of massive disruption and change.
Does it affect things like feudalism?
Big time. The labor shortage really empowered the surviving peasants and workers. They had more bargaining power, could demand better wages or conditions, or just leave for better opportunities. Land became more readily available. Food prices dropped initially. It seriously destabilized the old feudal order.
And we got quarantined out of it.
The origins of it, yes.
Yeah.
The city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, started requiring sailors and merchants arriving from plague-affected areas to isolate for 30 days at Trentino. This was later extended to 40 days, quarantino, giving us the word quarantine.
A public health measure born from catastrophe. What about religion? High clergy deaths, but did faith increase or decrease?
It was complex. Initially, maybe some despair, some feeling abandoned by God. Many smaller monasteries closed. Parishes struggled to find priests. But overall, it seems to have led to a new wave of piety, maybe more personal and devotional.
How so?
Growth of religious guilds focus on personal devotion to Jesus, Mary, the saints, more investment in religious art and church ornamentation in the following century. So not necessarily less religion, but perhaps a shift in its expression. Some even trace the beginnings of a stronger middle-class identity to the social shifts caused by the plague.
It's incredible. One event, ripple effects across everything. And of course, it didn't just happen once and go away.
No, absolutely not. As we said, the Black Death was just the start of the second plague pandemic. It kept coming back.
How often?
Pretty much constantly, somewhere in Europe or the Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries, right up until the late 17th century. One researcher compiled data suggesting plague was present somewhere in Europe every single year between 1346 and 1671.
Every year. For 300 years.
According to that data, yes. Now, maybe not huge continent-wide pandemics each time, but significant regional outbreaks were common. Major ones hit France, Italy, Spain again in the 17th century.
Did it eventually retreat from Europe?
Yes, largely by the 18th century. It lingered longer in North Africa into the 19th century. It also continued to ravage parts of the Islamic world, with frequent outbreaks in major cities like Cairo and Constantinople well into the 19th century.
And then the third pandemic started later.
Yes, the third major pandemic began in China in the mid-19th century, around 1855. That's the one that spread globally to all inhabited continents, caused millions of deaths, especially in India.
And that's when Yersin identified the bacterium.
Exactly. During the Hong Kong outbreak in 1894, which was part of that third pandemic, that pandemic also brought plague to North America for the first time, hitting San Francisco around 1900.
So what about today? Is plague gone?
Not entirely. We have effective treatments now, primarily antibiotics, and insecticides help control the fleas. There's even a vaccine, though its effectiveness varies.
But outbreaks still happen.
Yes, they do. Madagascar has had significant outbreaks relatively recently, including a particularly bad one in 2017. There's also a constant concern about antibiotic resistance. A resistant strain was found in Madagascar back in 1995.
So it's still out there.
It is. The modern case fatality rate is much lower with antibiotic treatment, maybe around 11%. But it's still a serious, deadly disease if not treated promptly, especially in regions with fewer resources.
A chilling reminder that these ancient diseases haven't entirely disappeared.
Definitely. Constant vigilance in public health is key.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. It's been a huge amount of information. What are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think first, the sheer scale and devastation of the Black Death. It was truly catastrophic, likely originating in Central Asia, caused by Yersinia pestis, and spreading through complex routes involving fleas, rodents, and humans.
And its arrival in 1347 changed everything.
Fundamentally, it triggered centuries of recurring outbreaks and profoundly reshaped almost every facet of life across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, demographics, economy, society, religion, culture, even potentially the environment. It was undeniably a major turning point in history.
The long shadow it cast is just incredible.
And the story isn't just historical. Understanding how societies dealt with it, the successes and failures, the science that eventually unlocked its secrets, it all remains incredibly relevant for how we face disease and societal disruption today.
Right. So thinking about that relevance,
Yeah.
considering the sheer scale of the Black Death, its long-term consequences, how does exploring this history maybe inform how we approach global health challenges or think about societal transformation today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Are there parallels we can draw between the 14th century and our own time? What crucial lessons might this devastating period offer us as we navigate future crises? Something definitely worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.